Lone rancher gives water to an injured Apache girl. At dawn, her people stood at his gate. The ranch was a sun-bleached purgatory, a desolate land that reeked of loneliness, regret, and a suffocating silence. Ethan, a hollowed-out man, knelt by his stream, the valley's lifeblood. His eyes constantly scanned the empty horizon, a habit learned in the bone orchard of Shiloh. That battle had taught him a brutal lesson: trust wasn't worth a plugged nickel. His isolation was a fortress, his colt the only law he answered to. Then he saw her. Collapsed by the water's edge was a wounded Apache girl, a crimson stain spreading on the thirsty earth. He could leave her, let the desert claim another soul. It was the safe choice, the choice that would keep his ghosts undisturbed. But as her shallow breaths fluttered in the dead air, he knew one thing for certain. This single act of mercy was about to cost him everything. The silence was the first thing you noticed. It was a physical weight in Ethan's valley, a pressure against the eardrums that made the buzz of a lone fly sound like a sermon. The sun hammered the land into a state of perpetual surrender, bleaching the soil to the color of bone and cracking it like ancient pottery. This was his kingdom of dust, a self-imposed purgatory, where the only ghosts were the ones he carried inside. He walked the fence line, his boots crunching a rhythm of monotonous duty. Check the wire, scan the ridge, keep the world out. The routine was a prayer against memory, a ritual to keep the screams of Shiloh from clawing their way up his throat. He was a hollowed-out man in a hollowed-out land, and that was the way he liked it. A quiet understanding between a man and his grave. He reached the stream, a silver artery in the parched flesh of the earth. He called it the vena cava, a grim joke from his time as a field medic. The lifeblood. His lifeblood. He knelt the cold water, a shock against his grimy fingers. That's when he saw it. A splash of buckskin and dark hair against the pale stones downstream. Not a deer. Not a coyote. Trouble. The word was a cold stone in his gut. He drew his Colt, the worn metal, a familiar comfort against his palm. He moved low and slow, his heart a frantic drum against the valley's oppressive silence. It was a girl, an Apache by the look of her beaded dress. Young. Too young for the death that was already clinging to her. A dark, ugly stain was spreading from her side, turning the clear water of his vena cava a sickening shade of pink. His mind screamed warnings, a chorus of battle-honed instincts. An ambush. A trap. Leave her. An Apache on his land meant riders were close. It meant a war party. It meant a debt written in blood that he had no intention of paying. He stood over her, the barrel of his Colt aimed at the space between her shoulders. Her breath was a shallow, fluttering thing, a bird with a broken wing. He nudged her with his boot. A soft moan escaped her lips. Just my damn luck. He rasped the words, swallowed by the vast emptiness. He knelt, his movements stiff. The wound was a gunshot, clean through. Someone had hunted her. He looked at her face, her features delicate, even under a sheen of sweat and dust. She couldn't be more than 16. For a gut-wrenching moment, he didn't see an Apache. He saw the face of his sister Sarah, pale with the fever that had taken her years ago. The same helpless fragility. The ghosts of Shiloh roared. They screamed of caution, of survival at any cost. But the ghost of his sister whispered something else entirely. With a curse that was half prayer, he holstered his pistol. He ripped a strip from his own worn shirt, his hands once steady enough to set a broken bone amidst cannon fire, now trembling slightly. He pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound. "Don't you go dying on me, girl," he muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. "You hear me? You ain't dying here." He scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. As he carried her back toward the lonely silhouette of his cabin, he felt the world shifting under his feet. The fortress he had so carefully built around his heart was crumbling. He had just invited the war back in. He laid her on his own cot, the clean linen, a stark contrast to her blood-soaked dress. As dusk bled across the sky, turning the clouds to shades of bruised violet, he worked cleaning the wound as best he could. He forced a little water between her cracked lips. She was alive. For now. Exhaustion finally claimed him. He slumped into a chair by the hearth, his rifle laid across his lap, and drifted into a fitful, dreamless sleep. He awoke with a jolt, not to a sound, but to the lack of it. The familiar morning chorus of birds was gone. The wind itself seemed to have died. The silence was different now. It was watchful. He rose, his joints aching, and crept to the grimy window. He peered through a crack in the wood, and the breath caught in his throat. The dawn was breaking, painting the eastern ridge in strokes of fire and gold, and silhouetted against that rising sun, standing perfectly still, were dozens of riders, warriors. Their forms were stark, silent, and absolute. They weren't attacking, they weren't shouting. They had simply surrounded his ranch, a ring of silent, patient judgment. His single act of mercy had just become a death sentence. The world held its breath. Ethan stood frozen at the window, a prisoner in his own home, watching the silent assembly on the ridge. They were statues carved from the morning light, their patience a more profound threat than any war cry. He could see the glint of the sun on a lance head, the dark shape of a bow, the unsettling stillness of a dozen pairs of eyes all fixed on his small, vulnerable cabin. This was a hunter's quiet, the quiet before the kill. He stumbled back from the window, his heart a wild bird trapped in his ribs. He shoved his heaviest piece of furniture, a solid oak chest, against the flimsy door. It was a fool's gesture, a child's defense against a tidal wave, but it was all he had. Stupid, he hissed to himself, the word a poison on his tongue. He slammed the shutters closed, plunging the room into a dusty gloom. Stupid, sentimental old fool. He had fled the chaos of the war, seeking a place where the only sounds were the wind and his own heartbeat. For years, he had succeeded. He had built a fortress of solitude, and in a single moment of weakness, he had torn it down with his own two hands. He had let the world in, and now the world stood on his doorstep, ready to burn it all to the ground. Every creak of the floorboards was the snap of a twig under a warrior's foot. Every gust of wind was the whisper of a nocked arrow. A soft sound from the cot cut through his rising panic. The girl was awake. He spun around, rifle raised, his knuckles white. She was pushing herself up on one elbow, her face pale, but her eyes sharp, intelligent. They held no fear, only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. She looked at him, then at the barricaded door, then at the rifle in his hands. Her gaze was not accusatory. It was simply assessing. Your family, Ethan's voice was a low, dangerous growl. They out there waiting for a signal. She said nothing. Her dark eyes, clear and deep, just held his. You come to collect my scalp for your trouble? He pressed the words, born of a fear so profound it had curdled into anger. The girl's gaze flickered from his face down to her own wound, a small wince of pain crossing her features. Then slowly, deliberately, she looked toward the water bucket sitting by the hearth. It was a simple gesture, a silent question, a plea. The sheer humanity of it knocked the air from his lungs. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't a threat. She was a thirsty, wounded child. He lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. He ladled some water into a tin cup, his hands shaking. As he approached the cot, the world dissolved into the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of dying men. Shiloh. He was kneeling in the mud again, trying to give a young Union drummer boy a drink. The boy's eyes were wide, just like the girl's, pleading. The water had just spilled over the boy's lips before his head fell back, his spirit gone. Water couldn't stop a bullet then. It wouldn't stop a lance now. He pushed the memory away, the effort making his head throb. He knelt beside the cot and held the cup to her lips. She drank her throat, working her eyes, never leaving his over the rim of the cup. The act was an anchor, a small solid thing in a swirling sea of fear. He redressed her bandage, his movements less rough this time. He broke off a piece of his own stale bread and offered it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and ate it with a slow, deliberate grace. An understanding passed between them in the dusty silence. They were not allies. They were not friends. They were simply two living souls trapped on the wrong side of a locked door waiting for death. The day bled away. The sun crawled across the sky, its light slanting through the cracks in the shutters, drawing long golden bars across the floor. The siege continued, silent, unmoving, absolute. As twilight began to cloak the valley in shadows, the tension in the small cabin became a living thing, thick and suffocating. Ethan knew what was coming. They were waiting for the dark. He checked the load in his rifle one last time, his hands slick with sweat. Then he saw it through the peephole. Movement. Not the full-scale charge he'd been expecting, not the screaming horde of his nightmares. A single figure detached itself from the line of warriors on the ridge, tall, broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of immense authority. He wore the headdress of a chief, and he was walking toward the cabin. Alone. Unarmed. The world shrank to the 20 yards of trampled dust between Ethan's porch and the approaching chief. Each step the man took was deliberate, measured landing, with a soft finality on the hard-packed earth. He was a mountain in motion, his presence immense, silencing the nervous chatter in Ethan's own mind. The setting sun was at his back, casting a shadow long and dark, a river of night that flowed directly to Ethan's door. This was no attack. This was an arraignment. Ethan's hands, slick with sweat, hovered between the oak chest, barricading the door and the cold steel of his rifle. His soldier's mind, the part of him that had survived Shiloh, screamed at the insanity of his position. One man is a target. One man is a scout. One man is the bait in a trap. A faint sound from the cot made him turn. The girl Nita was struggling to sit up, her eyes fixed on the approaching man. A single word, soft as a moth's wing, escaped her lips. Tata. Father. The word was a key, unlocking a door in Ethan's fear he didn't know existed. It wasn't a trap. It was a reckoning of a different kind. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of dust and a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. He pushed the heavy chest aside. The groan of the wood was the only sound in the world. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, leaving his rifle just inside his hands, held open at his sides. The chief stopped, a respectful 10 paces away. He was older than Ethan had thought, his face a roadmap of harsh seasons and quiet wisdom. He did not look at Ethan with anger. His gaze was heavy, searching, as if weighing the soul of the man before him. He raised a hand palm open in the universal sign of peace. Then he placed it over his heart. You. Give water. The chief said, his voice a low rumble like stones moving deep underground. His English was broken, but his meaning was absolute. He pointed a long finger toward the cabin, toward his daughter. You. Save. Ethan could only manage a stiff, uncertain nod. The chief Bearclaw swept his arm in a grand gesture, indicating the silent warriors who still lined the ridge like sentinels. We not come for war, he explained, his hands now moving in the elegant, fluid motions of sign language that Ethan vaguely understood. We come to watch, to protect. This is Circle of Honor. For her, he pointed to the cabin again, and for you. The revelation struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The terror he had endured all day, the frantic barricading, the heart-pounding fear, it had all been a misunderstanding. This wasn't a siege. It was a vigil. They hadn't been caging him in. They had been standing guard over him. A wave of shame, hot and sharp, washed over him. He had seen only enemies, only the color of their skin, and had been blind to the honor that stood plain as the mountains before him. Why Ethan's voice was a raw, humbled whisper. Why was she shot Bearclaw's face hardened, the lines deepening, the quiet wisdom in his eyes replaced by a cold, ancient anger. White man. Name. Silas. He spat the name as if it were poison. He wants the water. He wants this land. He thinks the earth is a thing to be owned, to be broken. He went on to explain. Nita had been tracking a deer near the stream when she overheard Silas and his men. They spoke of a plan, a way to drive the Apache from the valley for good. She had been seen, and they had shot her to silence her. She carries a truth he cannot allow to be spoken. Bearclaw finished his gaze locking with Ethan's. He hunts her still. He and his men. They think she is dead. When they find she is not, they will come. Here. The implication was clear. The circle of honor was not just for what Ethan had done. It was for the fight that was to come. Ethan looked from the father's unyielding face back to his own cabin. Nita now stood framed in the doorway, leaning against the post, a fragile testament to the truth in her father's words. The world had turned on its head. He was no longer a victim. He was a guardian. He was no longer alone. He was an ally. He gave Bearclaw a single weary nod. It was all the answer the chief needed. A silent pact was sealed, an alliance forged not in words, but in a shared threat and a debt of honor. Just as a sliver of relief settled in Ethan's chest, Bearclaw pointed to the south. They will come from there, from the dry canyons. But Ethan's eyes, trained to see the slightest change in the landscape, were fixed on the opposite horizon. To the east, a faint haze was rising against the deep purple of the twilight sky. It wasn't the wind. It was a dust cloud, small, tight, moving with a grim purpose. Chief Ethan said, his voice suddenly tight with a new, more immediate dread. I don't think they're in the canyons. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving into the shapes of riders moving fast. Too fast. Too disciplined. Silas was already here, and he had brought the war with him. There was no time. The fragile peace of the new alliance shattered into 1,000 pieces. The dust cloud on the horizon became a galloping wave of men and horses, a tide of violence rolling directly toward them. Shouts, sharp and ugly, tore through the twilight quiet. Bearclaw let out a deep, resonant cry, not of fear, but of command. The warriors on the ridge, who had been statues of honor, instantly became fluid shadows, melting into the gullies and behind the rocks that dotted the landscape. They had prepared for a vigil, but they were born for a war. The soldier in Ethan, the part of him he had tried to starve to death for a decade, roared back to life. The slow, weary movements of the rancher were gone, replaced by the grim economic efficiency of a man who knew the calculus of a firefight. Nita inside. Get down and stay down, he yelled, shoving her gently but firmly toward the cabin door. He sprinted to the porch, grabbing his rifle. The world narrowed to the front sight. The stock pressed hard against his shoulder, the familiar weight, a cold, terrible comfort. The ghosts of Shiloh were no longer whispering memories. They were screaming commands in his ear. Hold the line. Make every shot count. Do not break. The first rifle shot cracked from the line of charging riders, splintering the porch rail next to Ethan's head. He didn't flinch. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and one of the riders tumbled from his saddle, a limp bundle of greed and bad intentions. The battle for the ranch had begun. It was a chaotic, brutal symphony of lead and desperation. Silas's men charged with the arrogance of superior numbers, expecting to overwhelm a lone homesteader. They were not expecting a valley that fought back. From the rocks, the Apache warriors unleashed a volley of arrows and rifle fire, their positions almost invisible, their attacks coming from all sides. They were phantoms, their movements blending with the dying light, their war cries a chilling counterpoint to the bark of the attackers' Winchesters. Ethan fought from the fortress of his home, turning the small cabin into a pillbox. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his actions a grim, practiced dance. He was no longer just protecting his land. He was a linchpin in a desperate defense. Through the smoke, he saw the face of one of the attackers, a loudmouth drunk named Jeb from the saloon in town. This wasn't a raid. This was an extermination planned and executed. The sunset bled into a night of gunpowder and death. A bullet tore through the window frame, showering Ethan with glass. He ducked just as one of Silas's men tried to rush the porch. Before Ethan could bring his rifle to bear, an arrow sprouted from the man's chest, appearing as if from nowhere. He looked toward the rocks and saw a warrior give him a curt, sharp nod before disappearing again. Minutes later, he saw Bear Claw pinned down behind a shallow rise. Ethan laid down a blistering field of covering fire, forcing two of Silas's men to dive for cover, giving the chief the precious seconds he needed to move to a better position. Trust wasn't spoken. It was earned in muzzle flashes and spent cartridges. Inside, Nita was not cowering. Her fear had been forged into a cold, hard purpose. As Ethan fired his last shot from a spare pistol, she was there, handing him the other one, freshly reloaded, her small hand steady. The fury of the initial assault finally broke against the combined defiance of the rancher and the warriors. As full darkness fell, Silas's men retreated, pulling back from the kill box the valley had become. They were not gone, merely regrouping in the shadows, their campfires mocking pinpricks of light in the oppressive dark. The silence that returned was heavy, punctuated by the groans of the wounded. The ranch was scarred, the smell of blood and spent powder hanging thick in the air. They had survived. But the night was young. A voice slick with arrogance and rage cut through the darkness. "Ethan, you old ghost, I heard you lost your nerve at Shiloh. Should have stayed buried." It was Silas. His form was a dark shape by one of the distant fires. "You're protecting a dead girl and siding with savages over your own kind. That water is worth more than all of you put together. It belongs to men who know how to use it." Ethan remained silent, peering into the night. "Doesn't matter." Silas's laugh was a raw, ugly sound. "You're low on ammunition, and I've got all night. You and your new friends are on a graveyard, and you just don't know it yet. Get some sleep, soldier." His voice dripped with malicious certainty. "It'll be your last." The threat hung in the cold night air. Ethan looked at Bear Claw, who had slipped silently into the cabin beside him. He saw Nita, her face set and grim. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and facing a man who would burn the world down to get what he wanted. The battle was over. The war for the dawn had just begun. The night held a wounded quiet. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and the sharp, clean aroma of sage. A single lamp cast long dancing shadows, turning the small room into a sanctuary of ghosts. Nita moved with a quiet grace, her own pain forgotten, as she tended to a warrior's wounded arm, her hands guided by an ancient knowledge. Ethan sat across from Bear Claw at the small, rough-hewn table. The world outside was a circle of enemy campfires and waiting death, but in here, something fragile and profound was taking root. Ethan poured the last of his precious coffee into 2 tin cups, pushing one across the table. The chief met his gaze and gave a slow, deep nod. It was a gesture that transcended language, a shared sacrament between two old soldiers who understood the bitter cost of a long night's vigil. "This land," Bear Claw said, his voice a low murmur. "It has a heart. The stream, it is the vena cava, the vein of the mother. It gives life to all, to my people, to your cattle, to you." He looked at Ethan, his eyes holding the weight of generations. Silas does not see this. He sees only rock and dust to be conquered. A man who wages war on the earth itself has no soul. Ethan thought of Shiloh of the fields, turned to mud and blood of a different stream that had run red for days. He understood. It was Nita's voice that broke the heavy silence. She had been listening, her face a mask of concentration. "Not conquer," she said, her voice small but clear, her English broken yet sharp with urgency. "Poison." Both men turned to her. She limped forward, her eyes wide with the horror of a memory she had been holding back. Before the shot, she began, her hand trembling as she pointed toward the stream. "I was hidden. I heard them. Silas and his men. They have a wagon, a barrel." She struggled for the words, her brow furrowed in frustration. "Bitter metal dust. He say, 1 barrel in the Vena Cava, and the land will be a bone orchard in a month. No tribe, no cattle, nothing. He say the railroad will buy it for a plugged nickel then." The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. It was a truth so monstrous, so absolute in its evil, that it stole the air from the room. This wasn't a fight for land. It was a fight against the apocalypse. Silas didn't just want to win. He wanted to annihilate, to salt the very earth. The last of Ethan's weariness was burned away by a pure, white-hot rage. This went beyond his ranch, beyond the Apache, beyond everything. This was a sin against life itself, where Ethan's voice was a blade of ice. "Where did they plan to do it?" a place Nita whispered, "where the canyon walls weep. A narrow pass a mile upstream. They can roll the barrel right into the deepest pool." Ethan's mind, the soldier's mind, began to move. He knew the place. A death trap, a choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. A grim, terrible smile touched his lips for the first time in a decade. "He wants to poison your water," Ethan said, looking at Bear Claw, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "Let's make him drown in it." The rest of the night was not spent in fear, but in sharp, whispered strategy. A map was drawn in the dirt on the cabin floor. Ethan's knowledge of the ranch's terrain, Bear Claw's understanding of the ancient hidden paths, and Nita's crucial intelligence fused into a single, desperate plan. It was a beautiful, terrible gamble. Your warriors will make a show of abandoning the ranch. Ethan explained, his finger tracing a line in the dust. A feigned retreat to the south. Silas will think we've broken. He'll get arrogant. He'll take the bait and move his wagon toward the canyon pass to finish the job. Bear Claw nodded, his eyes alight with a fierce understanding. "And my men will circle back through the high ridges. We will seal the canyon from behind." "And Ethan said, looking at a hidden trail on his mental map, a goat path he hadn't used in years will be waiting for him above. He would climb the treacherous northern face of the canyon, to the place where a winter rock slide had left 1,000 tons of granite hanging precariously over the pass. Dawn was a promise of blood on the horizon. The warriors slipped out of the cabin, melting into the pre-dawn gloom to take their positions. Ethan stood on his porch, checking the last of his ammunition. He looked at Nita, who stood beside her father. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past. He was an anchor, a defender of the future. He met Bear Claw's gaze, and the two men clasped forearms, a bond sealed in the face of impossible odds. The sun began to rise, not with the promise of a new day, but as a silent witness to the valley's final violent judgment. The world was sharp and cold. Perched high on the canyon's northern ridge, Ethan was no longer a man but an extension of the rock itself. The granite was cold beneath his palms, the wind a sharp whisper in his ear, carrying the scent of pine and the metallic tang of imminent violence. Below, the Vena Cava carved its path a ribbon of life in a world holding its breath. He was the valley's silent judgment, the trigger of its last desperate hope. He saw them enter the pass. Silas rode at the head, his arrogance a palpable thing, even from this distance. Behind him, his men herded the wagon that carried the valley's death, its wheels groaning under the weight of the poison. They moved with the careless confidence of predators who believed their prey had already scattered. They did not look up. They never looked up. Ethan's gaze flickered to the opposite ridge. A flash of light, bright and sharp as a shard of glass, blinked once then twice. Nita. The signal. Now. He put his shoulder to the keystone, a massive, precariously balanced boulder that the winter frosts had worked loose years ago. He pushed his muscles, screaming in protest the ghosts of Shiloh, and the hope of a future all fueling a strength he didn't know he possessed. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then a low groan, a shiver that ran through the very bones of the mountain. A trickle of pebbles became a river of stones, and the river became a deafening, thundering roar. The avalanche was a force of pure, elemental fury. A wave of granite and earth cascaded down the canyon wall, a testament to the land's own brutal rage. It slammed into the pass, not on top of the men, but just behind them, sealing the exit with 100 tons of finality. A second, smaller slide triggered by a warrior across the way blocked the entrance. The trap was sprung. Chaos erupted below. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted in confusion and terror. And from the ridges above, the Apache warriors rose as one, their arrows falling like a sudden lethal rain. It was a massacre in a box. Silas, thrown from his horse, scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He saw the warriors, and then his eyes burning with hatred found Ethan a lone figure against the sky. "You!" Silas roared, his voice echoing in the confines of the canyon. He raised his pistol and fired wildly, the shots chipping stone near Ethan's head. But Ethan was already moving, scrambling down a treacherous goat path, his descent swift and sure-footed. This was his land. He knew its every handhold, its every secret. They met at the bottom, near the sacred water's edge. Silas lunged a wild, cornered animal. But Ethan was no longer the haunted rancher. He was a soldier defending his home. They wrestled in the shallows, the clear, cold water of the Vena Cava splashing around them. Silas was stronger, but Ethan was fueled by a righteous fire. He brought the butt of his rifle up hard under Silas's jaw. The man staggered back, his eyes rolling, and collapsed into the stream, the water washing over his face, pure and indifferent. When the dust settled, a profound quiet fell over the canyon. The battle was over. The warriors of the Circle of Honor stood on the rocks above their faces, grim but victorious. The Vena Cava flowed clean. In the days that followed, a new kind of silence settled over the valley. It was the silence of healing. The bodies were buried. The cost was counted. An unspoken peace treaty was written on the scarred earth. On the morning the Apache were to leave, Ethan stood on his porch. The cabin was pockmarked with bullet holes, a testament to the war it had endured. But it felt more like a home than ever before. Bear Claw approached him not as a chief, but as a man. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "The Vena Cava sings your name now," he said. "You are not a ghost of Shiloh. You are Nantan Ohi the Riverman." Nita stepped forward. The wound in her side was healing, but the strength in her eyes was ancient. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a small, smooth river stone worn into the shape of a bear. She pressed it into Ethan's hand, her fingers warm against his. No words were needed. It was a promise, a bond, a family. He watched them ride away, their forms growing smaller against the vast open sky until they were gone. Ethan stood there for a long time, the bear stone warm in his hand. He looked at his ranch, his fortress of solitude that had become a bridge between worlds. He was still alone. But for the first time in a decade, he was not lonely. The silence of the valley was no longer a curse. It was a song, and he was finally ready to listen.